Hello everyone, welcome back again. This is my quilting video number 8 and I'm attaching binding today. If you need to, go back to the first episode. There's a link down below in the description. So basically I'm just laying out the binding. As you can see, I've got it on the top, but you can do it on the bottom. You'll only be able to stitch one side with your machine, so choose which side you would prefer. For me, it doesn't really make too much of a difference, but I just like to do the machine stitch on the front side to make sure it's nice and even. If I have any weird little blips, they end up on the back. As you can see, I opened half of it. And my very edge of my binding, which will be in the middle eventually, is along the edge of my quilt. And some things to make sure you do is make sure it's lined up with the stitch where you hooked your top and your bottom together. You can see I have this pin angled here. That's because to make a corner, you're gonna sew it down at an angle, and then you'll come back and you will fold that over, which I'll show you in a little bit. So, I'm going to, I've got it all pinned down. I'm going to get this all stitched up. So as you can see, my stitches are super tiny, and that's because this is a lot of material going through my machine, which means the machine's not actually strong enough to pull it all the way through by itself. I have to kind of guide it through. There's my angle, so I can make a corner. And let's see if I can show you this. You just kind of fold it over to make a nice right angle there. Get it all straightened out. There will be a little bit of a pucker right at the corner, which after you've got it all put together will kind of disappear. But get that all lined up, and then line up your next edge. And then later, when it's time to attach it at the back, I'll show you how you flip the corner. Just pin that down and get stitched up until you get all the way back around. So as you can see, I've got this edge all stitched down from my corner down. Two edges come together in a nice little point. This piece flops over, just like when you're folding a package or gift wrapping. You get a nice clean edge there. So I'm going to finish attaching this and we'll get it all flipped around. So just like when we made the binding, we're going to attach the edges together on an angle and just pin it down, and when you stitch the back, it'll be hooked together properly. Sorry, that was a bit fast. I messed up the recording, but I think you get the idea. Now I'm going to just go around and trim the edges. Some of them aren't very even, so I'll just trim it to make sure that they are the same width as the binding, so that they fit nicely in there when I fold it all over. You can make it less than the width of your binding if you want a more creased edge on your quilt. I like my edges a little bit rounded and full and puffy, so I make it exactly the same width as my binding. It also is easier because then you can just use that as a line to cut the edges. So I'm gonna keep doing that all the way around, and then I will flip my binding over and get it all pinned down properly. Alright, so now that I've trimmed all the way around the edges, I'm just going to start attaching it with pins to make sure everything's laid out right. And then after I've attached the whole thing, I'll sew it together by hand. I'm starting at a corner. Any corner will do. This one had a bit of a funny spot that needed to be touched up with my hand sewing, so I'm switching to a different corner. You want a nice, good, clean start. So this corner is better. You can see how it folds over nicely to create that little edge there. You can stitch that closed if you want to. Like I've said before, I like my quilts to be a little bit more natural and puffy and homey, not extremely perfect. So I'm just going to fold this down. Like I said, the edge isn't perfectly flat, it's a little bit rounded. So you just pull it down so that your seams kind of line up with each other. The front seam, which you can see where you stitched at, and this seam, which will be hand stitching, which don't be intimidated, it's not as bad as it sounds. It does take a little while because it's a long stitch for a very large quilt, but it's really not that difficult or that bad. So I'm just going to continue going around carefully, pinning right on this seam where I want it, until I get all the way around the quilt, and then I will start stitching it down. Alright, so now that I've made it all the way around, I thought I would show you how we finish off this corner here. You can see it comes together nicely. You just keep it folded over. Fold it to the point where it makes a nice corner for you. And pin it down. I use the pin that I started with to kind of keep those lined up. And stick an extra one on this side, just, you know, hold everything in place. You can never have too many pins. I mean, I guess you could, but within reason. So there we go. It's all pinned together all the way around. If I see any spots that look a little wonky, I go back and add another pin or straighten it out a bit. You can see how that edge there, yeah, it all fits together good. So I have some brown thread. It's not the same exact color as my quilt, but it really doesn't matter as long as I mean, I don't want red or bright pink or anything odd like that. But even if you did, you know, it's a patchwork quilt, so it's not supposed to be perfect. So just get this needle threaded.
I have 2 lumps.
You have 2 lumps.
Like Mr. Gump.
Like Mr. Gump. So I'm going to start at the corner and kind of hide my first stitch in here. Because what I like to do is I like to put my needle in behind that first knot, and that really anchors it so that the knot doesn't get pulled out. So I leave the tail there so the knot doesn't slip, so I want to make sure that's hidden underneath. That's just the way I do it. I'm sure there are other ways, but I find that that works the best. So we're going to stitch this around. I want to get my corner in the right spot. So I've started my needle where I want my corner to be. And then I'm going to see if I can get in the light right. This is exactly where I want my corner. So I'm going to stitch through the very edge. Think about it like this. When you open a letter or an envelope, whether you're using a letter opener or a knife or a pencil or your finger, you want to get right under that top crease to get a nice clean rip. So the same idea here, you want your needle to run right through that edge so that your thread is right behind that crease, and then you do a stitch into your quilt, and you want to keep them all nice and straight so that your seam is nice and straight. So you do a straight stitch right along that edge through the quilt, and then you insert it into that crease in your binding. And you can make them really close together or a little bit looser, however you feel. It doesn't really matter because this is a kind of a hidden stitch. You won't really be able to see it if you do it properly. So the only place that your thread should be visible is right where your needle comes out of your quilt and goes into your binding, and there should only be a very, very small piece of thread visible there. You're not leaving big gaps between those 2 spaces. You're just going down into the quilt, straight up, and then straight into your binding, and continue doing that all the way around. It's pretty simple once you get the hang of it, and it'll go rather quickly. Alright, so we started off nicely with a nice hidden stitch at the corner, and we've sewn along here. You can see how there's little puckers in between each stitch, but the stitch itself is pretty invisible. Now the problem is you can never have a thread long enough to go all the way around your quilt, so you're going to have to hide that stitch and start a new one. You can see how I tied it off underneath the binding. And I will start my next section of thread the same way I started the corner, but underneath that edge. And I'll go all the way around, but I won't show you because that would take forever. And I will see you guys again in my next episode. Bye.